Hi everyone, thanks for coming back for part 3. I want to explain some more parallels between Genesis 7:11, which is a time of Noah, and when the Son of Man returns. But first I want to explain why Zechariah 14 is actually the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord's return, and why it's the same thing as the second coming. There's no two second comings, otherwise there would be a third coming. The day of the Lord is the second coming, and I just want to explain that by going to Matthew 24. And it's interesting that this happened at the Mount of Olives. Of course, when the Lord returns, he's going to come back the same way he went up. And it was at the Mount of Olives when Jesus ascended into heaven after 40 days, as you can see here in the book of Acts. But going back to Matthew 24, this is where Jesus talks about the second coming, about what it will be like when he returns. And I just want to point out why this is the same as what's described in Zechariah 14. And I've mentioned this before, but I believe a lot of the confusion comes from this word over here, which was translated as after in Matthew 24:29. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And this was really perplexing to me for a long time. I couldn't understand why this was the only scripture that talked about the sun and the moon being darkened after the tribulation, when all the other scriptures talk about that happening either at the time of the tribulation or before the tribulation. Over here in Joel 2:31, it says the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord. But if you look at this word in the Greek, you see that in the Hebrew, you see that this word before means in the face of. You see that it means face. So it's saying in the face of the great and terrible day of the Lord, the sun and the moon will be darkened. And there's many scriptures throughout the Bible that talk about the sun and moon being darkened on the day of the Lord. And so I was curious as to why this is the only verse that uses the word after. And like I said, I was stumped for a really long time about that, until one day I realized, or remembered, because I actually knew this, but for some reason it just didn't register. But this word in the Greek, which is translated as after, is this word right here. And this word actually means with. It can also mean after. In fact, that's what it means to this day. It means after, but during the time of the New Testament, it actually meant with more often than it meant after. You can see that it was translated as with 345 times, and it was only translated as after 88 times. So it can mean both with and after, but it primarily means with in the New Testament. And you can see over here all the times that it's translated as with as opposed to after. You can see most of the time it's translated as with. And so I believe this word would have more correctly been translated as with. I believe it should have said immediately with the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then it goes on to say, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And so this is a parallel to Zechariah 14, actually starting with Zechariah 12, where it says, and I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. And that day shall be a great mourning in Jerusalem, as the mourning of Hadadrimmon in the valley of Megiddon. This is also parallel to Revelation 1:7, where it says, Behold, he cometh with the clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him, even so, amen. And this word wail is actually the same word that was translated as mourn in Matthew 24, and you see that it's translated as mourn in some of these other translations, such as the NIV, and many of these other translations use the word mourn. You see over here it uses mourn, this one uses mourn. This one uses mourn. So most of them use mourn rather than wail, but it's the same word that was translated as mourn in Matthew 24. Okay, so I just wanted to explain that because there's a lot of people who believe this is two separate events when the Lord returns. And you see that this is coming up in Zechariah 14:4, where Jesus is standing on the Mount of Olives, but then it goes on to say that all the saints will be with him. It says, and ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach into Azal, and ye shall flee like as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with thee. And then you see in Revelation 14:4 that Jesus is standing on Mount Zion with all the saints. Over here it says, and I looked, and lo, a Lamb stood on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads. And also in Matthew 24 it says, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains. And so when you put in flee to the mountains, you see that in Zechariah 14, that's when it talks about fleeing to the mountains. And it gives the added detail over here about the valley of the mountains. And so this was actually what led to my understanding of what was going to happen with the Mountain of Olives, which was confirmed by Natan's testimony. And I've made videos about that before, so I don't want to get into that too much with this video. And so I just want to point out some more parallels between Genesis 7:11 and the second coming, or the day of the Lord, the day when Jesus comes back, or the day of the rapture. And I want to explain a little more why I believe this has to do with the DNA, the windows of heaven being opened. Over here in the Greek it said the cataracts of heaven were opened, but in the Hebrew it uses this word over here, which is translated as windows. But when you look at it in the Hebrew, it doesn't actually mean window exactly. It means lattice, window, or sluice. And when you look at it over here, it says interwoven work or network lattices. And it comes from this word over here, which it says over here it means to lie in wait, to ambush or lurk, but when you look further down it says to knot, to weave, to intertwine or network, or to tie or to mingle. And so I was curious about this word sluice over here. I didn't know what a sluice was. And over here it says it's a sliding gate or other device for controlling the flow of water, especially one in a lock gate, an act of rinsing or showering with water. And so when you look at images of a sluice, you see images that look like this. And what I realized when I looked at these images is that it looks like something like a chute, like as in chutes and ladders. And here's an interesting image over here, but I put in the word chute to see if that was the same thing. So I put in chute. But first let me just show you the definition for chute so you can see that it means the same thing. It says an inclined channel as a trough, tube, or shaft for conveying water, grain, coal, etc. to a lower level. A waterfall or steep descent is in a river. Water slide is an amusement park. A steep slope as for tobogganing. Okay, so here's some images of a chute. And as you can see how some of these spiral. I thought this one was really interesting over here. This obviously looks like a DNA helix. And you have this one over here. It's a water slide. And so I think it's pretty clear to see how some of these images seem to resemble DNA. You can see this is described as the DNA ladder, but you can see how this resembles lattice work. And then over here you have the double helix, which seems to resemble this chute or the sluice, especially this image over here. And then you have the definitions over here where it's described as interwoven work, network, lattice. And when you look at the root word for this word, you see that it means to knot, to weave, or to intertwine, or to mingle. But it's interesting that it also has a negative connotation because it also means to lie in wait or to ambush. And then when you go back to the primary word here, which was the Strong's number 699, you see that it also means a chimney or smoke hole. And so I wanted to pull up an image of this word right here in the Hebrew, even though I really don't know much about Hebrew. I thought maybe it would pull up something that looks like DNA, maybe some interwoven work. I wasn't sure what it would pull up, but I just copy and pasted this word over here. And you can see here where I copy and pasted it, and you can see that it's Strong's number 699. But when you look at the images, what comes up is really interesting. And this is actually what comes up for the images. And so this makes sense when you consider the fact that the abyss is going to be open. As it says here in Genesis 7:11, it says the fountains of the great deep were opened, and this word deep means the abyss. And I pointed out how when the Mount of Olives splits, the abyss is going to be open. There's going to be a great chasm. And of course Revelation 9 talks about the pit being open and the smoke coming out of the pit. And then in verse 11 is where it talks about Abaddon coming out of the pit. And so I believe this is the other transformation that's going to take place. And I talked about that before when I did this table over here on transmutations and these two videos over here. But I'm about out of time, so I'll have to continue in the next video. Thank you.